Good evening and welcome to tonight's pre-publication conversation with Dr. Jonathan White on his forthcoming book, A House Built by Slaves, African-American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Before we introduce tonight's guest, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us tonight. This Saturday, February 12, 2022, is the 213th birthday of our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. In honor of his life and legacy, we hope that you will consider supporting our foundation following tonight's program as we continue in our commitment to the unfinished work of our time. You can donate by visiting our website at alplm.org. We have been honored during this series to host some amazing authors, and I know you're really going to enjoy tonight's program. As always, we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as we are able to. And now, without further ado, please help me in welcoming our foundation president and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin.
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our first episode of the Fourscore Speaker Series for 2022. We are so delighted to welcome back Dr. Jonathan White for a special pre-publication conversation about his newest book. John White is Associate Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He is author or editor of 13 books and more than 100 articles, essays, and reviews about the Civil War. His earlier book, Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Re-Election of Abraham Lincoln, was named a Best Book of 2014 by Civil War Monitor, was a finalist for both the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and the Jefferson Davis Prize, and won the Abraham Lincoln Institute's 2015 Book Prize. Midnight in America, Darkness, Sleep, and Dreams During the Civil War was named a Best Book of 2017 by Civil War Monitor. His 2018 book, Our Little Monitor, The Greatest Invention of the Civil War, co-authored with Anna Gibson Holloway, was a finalist for the Indie Book Awards and honorable mention for the John Lyman Book Award. He's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, serves on the boards of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and the Abraham Lincoln Association, and he's the vice chair of the Lincoln Forum. He also serves on the Ford's Theater Advisory Council, the editorial board of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, and as the editor of the Lincoln Forum Bulletin. In 2019, John won the Outstanding Faculty Award of the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, the highest award given to faculty in the Commonwealth. And John has had a prolific year, publishing My Work Among the Freedmen, the Civil War and Reconstruction Letters of Harriet M. Buss, which he co-edited with his student Lydia Davis, To Address You as My Friend, African Americans' Letters to Abraham Lincoln, and the book we'll be focusing on tonight, A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House, which is officially being released on Lincoln's birthday this year. John, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
To kick things off, John, tell us what gave you the idea to write A House Built by Slaves.
Well, it started with the book of letters that you mentioned, and I wanted to do a book of conversations and correspondence between African Americans and Abraham Lincoln. And I started collecting correspondence from African Americans around 2014. And so I just started finding as many things as I could. And eventually I realized that I had way too much for a single book. So I broke it into two. I published the letters with UNC Press in October as To Address You as My Friend, and then put the conversations or the visitors as a separate book.
Your title sets up an important contrast. The fact that enslaved African Americans helped build the White House, people's house as we think of it, that they themselves didn't really have access to as citizens in the same way white Americans did. And the fact that Abraham and his wife Mary welcomed African Americans into the White House at guest, which was at the time a noteworthy thing.
Right.
Can you tell us more about the contrast and the context of that?
Sure. The title comes from Michelle Obama's 2016 DNC speech. And she said, this is the story of America. And she tells, very quickly, obviously, but the history from slavery to civil rights. And then she says, so that every morning I wake up in a house that was built by slaves. And I thought that that line from her speech really captures some of the racial transformation that has gone on in American history. And that's something that I think was really important in the Lincoln White House. And I don't think we've recognized the extent to which Lincoln's White House became an egalitarian place. That, yes, prior to the Civil War, African Americans would have almost never been welcomed there as guests. I found a few handfuls of examples where it happened. James K. Polk buys and sells 19 enslaved people while he's the sitting president of the United States. And so before Lincoln's inauguration, African Americans are more likely to be bought and sold as slaves than to be welcomed as guests by a sitting president. And that changes in a dramatic way during the Civil War. Hundreds of African Americans meet with Lincoln at the White House or in wartime Washington, D.C., and he welcomes them as he would another guest, any other white guest who would come to meet with him. Frederick Douglass, who I'm sure we'll talk about, loved telling people about how kindly Lincoln treated him. Lincoln shook all of the hands of his guests, which we can't discount. In the 19th century, it was very unusual for a white person to shake a Black person's hand. And yet Lincoln did that with every single visitor, whether a Black man or a Black woman coming into the White House. So I wanted to tell that story, which I think just hasn't really been told before.
Mm-hmm. How did people in Lincoln's party react to this? And then more broadly, how did maybe white Northerners react to this? And then how did the opposition party react to this?
Yeah, we tend to think, abolitionists are going to be egalitarian, right? And yet they're not. So picture Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune. When he ran for president in 1872, a delegation of African Americans from Pennsylvania go up to him and try to shake his hand, and he very ostentatiously chose not to shake their hands. In another instance, Robert Gould Shaw's father, Robert Gould Shaw, of course, famous colonel of the 54th Massachusetts in the movie Glory, his father was an abolitionist in New York and Boston, and he was approached by a Black visitor, and he just very rudely shooed him out of his office. That Black visitor met with Lincoln, had a very different experience meeting Lincoln at the White House. And so on the one hand, I think that Northern Republicans were fairly sympathetic to Lincoln's treatment of African Americans, and yet many of them wouldn't have behaved the same way themselves. People like Greeley certainly wouldn't have behaved or didn't behave the same way himself. But you look at the Northern opposition, the Democratic opposition, I mean, for them, this is outrageous. How can a president allow Black people into the White House as guests? How can he shake their hands? How can he let them use the grounds of the White House for picnics? And the Northern press reports on this very broadly, and Democratic newspapers use the N-word all the time to talk about how Lincoln is treating African Americans. And then those reports circulate even beyond the North into the South. And I found diary entries by white Confederates who say, well, look at what Lincoln's doing. He's allowing Black people in at his public receptions. And in their minds, that justified their decision to secede. If Lincoln is going to bring about social equality, then the South was right to do what they did. And so what's important to then take away from all of this is that Lincoln knew there was a great political risk to do what he did with the White House. And yet he did it anyway. He knew the newspapers were going to report on it, but that didn't stop him. And I think African Americans appreciated that. I mean, Frederick Douglass, who met Lincoln 3 times, said that there was not much to be gained by doing this. It took great political courage, and he admired Lincoln for being the way he was.
Mm-hmm. And you provide important context in your book, John, that I know is, and even having lived in DC for as long as I did, you're used to access to public elected officials being very restricted. Mm-hmm. With the president, you have the motorcade, you have the layers of security detail, all the security checkpoints. You can't just walk up to the White House and have a picnic there. You can't just walk through the front door and shake the president's hand. So it's important, as you do, to note that there was much greater access at the time, generally speaking. However, you also articulate that this particular access, Black Americans' access to the White House and to Lincoln in this social way, was unusual enough that people were taking note of it. And you just referenced, newspaper reports and people saying this justified secession. I'm imagining that some people might be wondering, why does this matter? They're just visiting the White House. If visiting was more common, is this access to the president actually that significant? And what did it mean? How did people think that Black Americans being able to visit the president would in any way affect their rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, yeah, first, we often forget that presidents in that era held office hours, much like I do. I'm in my office here at CNU, and hopefully no one will knock on my door. I put a note on the door, but students can come in at any time when I'm here and talk. And that's how the president's office was. There were office hours, and anyone who wanted to could go in and talk to Lincoln. Prior to the Civil War, African Americans generally don't do that. I found one instance where Paul Cuffey goes to meet with James Madison because he had had a ship seized, and so he goes to meet with the president to try to get justice done. I found another instance where a Black man from Washington had had his coat taken by a servant, and he goes to Jefferson and he says, "Hey, this servant took my coat," and Jefferson looks at it and gives it back to him. So there are a few moments where Black people prior to the Civil War make use of this openness that or accessibility that there is to the president, but it's almost unheard of for African Americans to do that. But that changes beginning as early as April of 1862, where Black men begin going to meet with Lincoln to try to push him on policy issues. So in April of 1862, Daniel Payne, who's a bishop in the AME Church, goes and meets with Lincoln to try to push him to sign the DC Emancipation Act. And then later that week, two men who are pro-colonization go to meet with Lincoln and push him on that issue. And over time, more and more people will begin to meet with Lincoln. And what I think is going on is that for the first time in the history of the country, Black Americans feel that they have a president who is interested in them and their rights and their problems and their equality. And so, whereas before they wouldn't have been able to petition a president because they often wouldn't feel like there would be any reason to, what good is going to come of it? Here, Lincoln is their president too. And so in a very real way, they're claiming a First Amendment right. The First Amendment guarantees the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so they're going to claim that right. We are part of the people. We are citizens. Lincoln is our president. This is our people's house too. And we're going to go there to say what we need to say.
Yeah, let's dig into that first visitor that you record of Lincoln. So the first African-American to visit the Lincoln White House, Daniel Payne, born free this month in 1811 in Charleston, South Carolina. And we could spend the entire hour talking about Bishop Payne and his remarkable life and times, having to close his first school after the restrictive laws passed after Nat Turner's rebellion, for example. But to set the stage just a little bit, when Lincoln met him for the first time, he was already Bishop Payne of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was already one of the founders of Wilberforce University in Ohio. And though not quite yet its president, that would come in 1863, making him the first African-American president of a college in the United States. So he was coming to Abraham Lincoln, an incredibly accomplished man, highly educated, highly respected leader in 1862. What was the purpose of his visit? You referenced the DC Emancipation Act.
Yeah.
And what were his impressions of how that visit went? And who did he tell it to? Who did he share that with?
Yeah, so Payne is one of the few African Americans who had gone to the White House before the Civil War. After the Princeton disaster, I want to say in 1844, where some gun explodes on a ship on the Potomac River, kills half the cabinet and some other people. He went to the White House to deliver a funeral sermon for a Black servant who had been killed. And he had a very just not a very pleasant experience meeting President Tyler. Tyler did not treat him particularly well. He then, a number of years later, almost 20 years later, goes back to the White House, this time to meet Lincoln. And he wanted to push Lincoln on this question of DC emancipation. So Congress had passed a law that would abolish slavery in Washington, DC. The law had money that would provide for colonization, about $500,000 for colonization. It provided compensation for the slave owners, but not any for the enslaved people themselves. And people weren't sure if Lincoln was going to sign it. And so some people were going to the White House to push Lincoln to sign it, and other people were going to the White House to get Lincoln not to sign it. And no one quite knew what Lincoln was going to do. And so Payne goes to the White House, he presents his card, and he's ushered in, and he goes to meet with Lincoln, and they talk for about 45 minutes. And Payne makes the case that Lincoln should sign this law. And Payne was struck by how kindly Lincoln was towards him, and that Lincoln listened. And Lincoln didn't give him an answer then. He didn't say, yeah, you're right, I'm going to sign it. But Payne went away satisfied. And a report of this showed up in the newspapers in New York in the Anglo-African. And then Payne, a number of years later, wrote out a full description of what happened in this meeting. Now, personally, I don't think Payne had anything to worry about. I think Lincoln was planning to sign this law, and historians disagree about this point. The law had almost everything Lincoln wanted. He wanted compensation for slave owners because the Fifth Amendment guarantees that if property is taken away from a citizen, that they get just compensation. He wanted money for colonization. The only thing that the law didn't have that Lincoln would have liked was a provision that allowed the white people of Washington, D.C. to vote on this question. In 1849, Lincoln had proposed a bill in Congress that had that provision in it. The 1862 law didn't, but I think Lincoln saw, look, this is constitutional. Congress can legislate for the District of Columbia. I'm going to sign this thing. And African Americans celebrated the passage of this law. Payne did, Henry Highland Garnett, and others celebrated this as a step towards freedom in this country. And in fact, again, in the 1990s, I want to say, it became a holiday in the District of Columbia, so that now April 16th is celebrated, and the schools are closed and government buildings are closed to celebrate DC emancipation.
Important anniversary. They've changed how they celebrate it over the years, that it's finally a fixed holiday. Yep. And something that there's a lot of activity and education around, which is important. So Payne's visit is focused more on emancipation, and you return to that in later chapters of your book, but then there are several chapters that you devote to colonization. And it's the idea of voluntary colonization and the visitors Lincoln had on that subject and his related efforts. And his efforts to make some of those conversations specifically public. I love the fact that you referenced the stenographer who's present for one of them. What did you find in your research about those visits and the individuals who were in the room? Like, how did those conversations maybe differ from the other ones that were about issues like emancipation?
Yeah, so Lincoln had a number of meetings with African Americans who supported colonization to Liberia for the most part, but some to other regions as well. And most of those were private meetings. So he met with the president of Liberia, who was originally from Virginia. He met with 2 Liberian commissioners who were trying to push for emigration. He met with a Black Baptist minister named Chauncey Leonard, who wanted to try to lead African Americans out of the country to Liberia. So he's having a lot of private meetings, but he did have one very public meeting, and this was on August either 14th or 16th. Now the date is escaping my mind, but 1862. Lincoln had an immigration commissioner named James Mitchell. Mitchell went to the Black community in DC, said the president wants to meet with some delegates. And so they meet at a church in DC and elect 5 Black leaders to go to the White House. And this is a really incredible moment, because this is the first time in the history of the country that a sitting president has invited a delegation of Black men to come to the White House for a political discussion. Now, Lincoln had a strategy in mind in this meeting, and that was he wanted the white American public to know that he supported colonization. So he calls these 5 Black leaders into the White House. He has a stenographer there to write down everything that he says. He lectures them in a very condescending way, and then they go away to decide whether or not they're going to support Lincoln's plan. He blames African Americans as the cause of the war and tells them they should go to Panama.
Not slavery as the
right,
cause.
That's right. Yeah. Not slavery, but the presence of African Americans. And, Frederick Douglass reads this and writes about it in Douglass's Monthly, and Douglass is irate over this. And in fact, Douglass will still mention this meeting 12 years later in 1876, or 14 years later, in his dedication speech at the statue of Lincoln in DC. And so
the Lincoln Park
right.
sculpture, right?
The
Yeah,
one in Lincoln
the
Park,
Freedman Memorial, yeah.
And so, African Americans are really put off by this meeting. Lincoln had a strategy, and in the book, I call this, I think, something like the most unfortunate moment in Lincoln's presidency, or something like that, or one of the most regrettable. That's how I put it, one of the most regrettable. So it's regrettable that Lincoln took the approach he did. Now, the reason he did it was he was planning to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. He knew that most white Northerners would oppose it. And so he wanted to basically say to them, look, I'm going to try to get freed people out of the country. So I'm supporting colonization. So when emancipation comes, you don't have to worry about it. One of the things that I detail in the book is that around this time, Lincoln also met with a Black minister named Henry McNeill Turner, who was a regular correspondent for the Christian Recorder, which was a Black newspaper in Philadelphia. And Lincoln essentially says to Turner, you don't have to worry about this. I was just looking for a place to point to, is how Turner quotes Lincoln. In other words, I'm using this as a way to prepare the white electorate for what's coming, and emancipation's coming. Now, that said, again, this is one of the most regrettable moments of Lincoln's presidency, because the white North is very racist, and there was some violence against African Americans in the aftermath of this meeting with the Black delegation. But I will say, and this is one of the big points I try to make in the book, is that the meeting with the Black delegation is one of the few that most people highlight today. Yeah. And they hold it up as exemplary of, this is how Lincoln treated African Americans. And nothing could be further from the truth. This is the one meeting where Lincoln lectured his guests. Every other meeting, Lincoln listens patiently and kindly and converses in a give and take dialogue. This is the one exception. And so I put it out there. I think it's chapter 2 of the book, or 3. People need to know it, but they also need to know the broader context of the meeting, and also the broader story of Lincoln's interactions with African Americans.
Yeah, and Frederick Douglass will occasionally comment on, double speak that Lincoln's engaging in, and sort of the politics of it, if you will, versus more the activism, maybe. Right. How did Turner actually react to this? Lincoln's telling him, "Oh, don't worry about it," but what's his response?
Well, all we know is what he wrote in this newspaper story, and he said, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but he said something along the lines of, this is as much as I can tell you, but I'm not going to say too much because I don't want the door closed on me. In other words, if I divulge too much of what Lincoln tells me, then, I might lose my access to the president. But Turner was out there saying to his readership, we don't need to be as concerned as maybe we are, or as we initially were upon reading accounts of this meeting.
Mm-hmm. So then Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation after the Confiscation Acts, after DC emancipation, after the flirtation with voluntary colonization. And the Emancipation Proclamation represents his current position at that time, including the idea of raising Black regiments, arming African Americans.
Yeah.
What does the record show about the influence Black visitors in particular had on encouraging that, either before he came out with it publicly and or after it's issued and signed?
Yeah, so African Americans begin volunteering for the Army as early as April of 1861. Yep. In the book I have of Black correspondence, I have a letter from a guy named Levin Tillman in New York, who writes to Lincoln in April, says, hey, if you want Black soldiers, you know where to find us, contact me. And Lincoln rejects the use of Black soldiers. Now, politically, it would have been politically suicidal if Lincoln had started arming Black men in 1861. The border states would have seceded. DC would have been surrounded by an enemy nation at that point. So he just couldn't do it. But Lincoln also feared that Black soldiers would be cowardly. At one point, he said that he was afraid if he put guns into the arms of Black men, that they would very quickly wind up in the hands of Confederates. And so for the first year and a half of the war, he opposes the use of Black soldiers. But I think that a Black visitor had an important role in changing Lincoln's view of this issue. So in May of 1862, Robert Smalls, who is a slave on a ship in Charleston, South Carolina, captures the ship before dawn. He steals it. It's the Confederate CSS Planner. He steals it along with 15 other African Americans, including his wife and children, takes it through the harbor. He's a pilot on the ship, so he knows all the signals to give to the Confederates who are guarding the harbor, and then he makes it out to the Union blockading vessels and turns it over to the Union. And Smalls becomes a hero for this. Within about 2 or 3 weeks, Lincoln signs a law giving Smalls the salvage amount or part of the salvage that the planter was worth, and he becomes a hero. Well, Smalls makes his way up to Washington, D.C. in August of 1862. He gives a speech at Henry McNeil Turner's church before an audience of 1,200 people, white and Black. And Turner calls him something like, now I forget the quote again, but a specimen of African heroism is what he calls him, and says that he did a pretty good job for the first time in public speaking in front of such a huge audience. And then Smalls met with Lincoln. Now, what's amazing to me is that for as much of a national hero as Smalls was, that I could find no account from 1862 of this meeting, none.
Oh my goodness.
But Smalls was elected to Congress in 1874, served 10 years in Congress. And in 1886, I think it was, Smalls gave a speech in Congress where he recounted meeting with Lincoln and with Secretary of War Stanton. And so we don't know what Smalls said to him, but we can presume that Smalls told him the story of his escape. I mean, this hero's meeting with Lincoln. Lincoln's going to want to hear, what did you do? How did you do it? I want to hear the story. And what we do know is that Smalls then went back to South Carolina with a letter from the War Department authorizing the raising of Black volunteers. So something happened in that meeting between Lincoln and Smalls, where Lincoln then allows the War Department to change policy in South Carolina. Remember, May of 1862, the very month that Smalls escapes, Lincoln's old friend Hunter, David Hunter, issues an order freeing the slaves. Lincoln says, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Hunter tries to arm Black men. No, you can't do that. A few months later, Lincoln meets a Black guy who showed, hey, we're not going to be cowardly. And Lincoln gives him, or the War Department gives him a letter. So I think that was a very real policy change that came about because of a meeting with a really amazing and heroic Black visitor.
Access and influence. Based on what you found, how much did it seem like one great change led to the advocacy of another? And so in particular, you know, we've gone through emancipation. Now this idea of having US colored troops coming to fruition. Next up, Black suffrage.
Yeah, well,
limited Black. Oh, go ahead.
I would say next up, inequality for Black soldiers.
Yes. Okay.
Because
absolutely.
Black men enlist expecting to be paid $13 a month like white soldiers. Instead, they get paid $10 a month as laborers. And because they were paid as laborers, they had an additional $3 deducted from their pay each month. So they're making just over half of what they were expected. And so Frederick Douglass goes to the White House and presses Lincoln on this. And Douglass pushes Lincoln on the issue of Jefferson Davis pledges to enslave or execute Black soldiers captured on the battlefield, to treat them like slaves in insurrection. And so the first step, I think, is Douglass pushing Lincoln on these issues. And then the question of Black suffrage comes up. And in the spring of 1864, at least three delegations of Black Southerners come to the White House and push Lincoln for the right to vote. And their argument is, look, Black men could vote at the time of the Revolution, which is absolutely true. This is something that most Americans have no idea about. At the time of the Revolution, restrictions on voting had to do with how much property you had, not what the color of your skin was. And in the very earliest days, most states had no race-based restrictions. As many as 11 or 12 of the original states allowed Black men to vote at some point between 1776 and 1778. Now, that right to vote gets taken away in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. And so these Black visitors come to the White House and they say, look, Black men used to be allowed to vote, and there was never a problem with it. And by the way, Black men served in the American Revolution, and they fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, and we're fighting now, and we should have the right to vote. Now, Lincoln was very receptive to these arguments, but from his perspective, the Constitution gives the states power over suffrage, and so this wasn't something that he as president could do. But he said, I do support you in pushing for this, and I hope that you get this right. Now, one of the delegations were two Black men from New Orleans, and I can't prove this, but I think that they met with Lincoln twice. They brought a petition that was signed by 1,000 people in January of 64. They bring it and they meet with Lincoln on March 3rd or 4th, 1864. And they present it to Lincoln, and they were the first two signatories, and then the next 28 were Black veterans of the War of 1812. And they say, look, we are wealthy, elite African Americans from Louisiana, we pay taxes, we do all this stuff, we should be allowed to vote. And Lincoln shows sympathy for their request, but says, again, I'm president, I can't just do it because I'm president. Come up with a rationale for why Black suffrage would help win the war and save the Union, and then we'll talk. And so these two guys go away, they meet with Charles Sumner and some other people, and then on March 10th, they write a new petition. And in this one, they make the case that most, if not all, white Southerners are disloyal, whereas most, if not all, Black Southerners are loyal. And if you want to preserve the Union, when you bring the nation back together, the best way to preserve small r Republican government is to give Black men the right to vote. And Lincoln is persuaded by this argument. Now, the very next day, what I think is the next day after their second meeting with Lincoln on March 12th, Lincoln sends a private letter to the governor-elect of Louisiana, a guy named Michael Hahn. And Lincoln says to Hahn, this is a private suggestion as Louisiana is starting to reconstruct its government, but perhaps you should allow Black men who are educated or who have served in the army to vote, he said, so that in some trying day to come, the jewel of liberty may be preserved in the family of freedom. In other words, if we want to preserve the government, the best way to do that is to bring loyal Black voters into the body politic. And so again, here is a moment where there's a give and take between Lincoln and different delegations, and he listens to them and they listen to him, and they learn from one another, and his view of an issue changes. And this is a remarkable thing. I mean, Lincoln in the 1830s and 40s had publicly scoffed at the idea of Black voting. In 1858, Lincoln says, I'm not in favor of making Black people into voters. Now in 1864, he begins working behind the scenes to push for Black suffrage. A year later, on April 11th, 1865, he would publicly support limited Black suffrage. And one man standing in the audience didn't like that, and his name was John Wilkes Booth. And we all know what happened 4 days later.
Yeah. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm gonna
Sure.
maybe ask a few more questions here, and then we'll turn over to our audience questions. We've touched on some of the more intimate meetings. I mean, yes, when he invites the delegation, he has the stenographer there, and yes, people go and either publish in their own newspapers or talk to the press about their visits with Lincoln. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there was a social element to a lot of these visits, including at big events like New Year's Day, having Black visitors amongst the attendees. And tell us about Reverend Henry Johnson, who was at the White House for the huge event in 1864.
Yeah, so on New Year's Day, 1864, there's a public reception, and for the previous 60 years, only white people are showing up for these receptions. And the way it worked was that anyone who wanted to could go in and shake the president's hand. So the gates would open, I think, around 10 a.m. And first dignitaries and ambassadors and generals and admirals would go in. And then about an hour later, the doors would be open. And on this particular day, 4 Black men decide to go and walk into the White House and shake the president's hand. So Henry Johnson is a minister from New York. He's one of them. Another one of the 4 was Charles Lennox Rowman. And these guys go in and they shake Lincoln's hand. And Johnson then writes about it for the New York Anglo-African, what it was like to meet Lincoln. And then he met Secretary of State Seward and Seward's daughter. I mean, he's just brought in and welcomed into the White House in a way that would have been unthinkable before. And the newspapers catch wind of this and they're just apoplectic about it. Well, the Democratic newspapers are. How can Black people be going into the president's reception? They see it as undignifying. But what's really incredible is there were 2 Black doctors in Washington, D.C. who must have read about this in the newspapers. One of them was named Alexander T. Augusta, who was born about a half hour south of where I'm sitting right now in Norfolk, Virginia. The other one was named Anderson Abbott. His parents were from Alabama. They had been free, but they were treated so badly in the 1830s that they fled to Canada, and Anderson Abbott was born there. These 2 men meet in Canada where they train to become physicians. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, they join the Union Army. They jump through a lot of hurdles, face a tremendous amount of discrimination, and become doctors and officers in the Army. And so presumably they read about these 4 Black men going to the White House on January 1st, 1864. And so one night, February 24th, 1864, they decide, you know what, we heard there's a reception tonight, we're going to go. And so they boldly go to the White House. They walk in, they take off their winter coats, hand them over to a servant, go in, they're introduced to Benjamin Brown French, the Commissioner of Public Buildings. He introduces them to the president. And Lincoln goes to shake the hand of Alexander Augusta. And Mary Lincoln sees this and sends her son Robert over, and Robert comes over to the president, his father, and says, are you going to allow this what's the word he uses? I'm blanking on this, but are you going to allow this to happen? And Lincoln turns to his son and says, why not? And at that point, Robert slinks back over to Mary, and Lincoln turns back to Alexander Augusta and shakes his hand, and then turns to Anderson Abbott and shakes his hand. And then the 2 men walk through the East Room, and they're trying to, Abbott wrote a long account of this. And I should say, if you're not a member of the Lincoln Forum, you should join the Lincoln Forum. And in the spring issue, I'm going to be publishing Anderson Abbott's account of this. So you can read it word for word. And you should also buy my book and read what I have to say about it. But you can read Anderson Abbott's account in the spring issue of the Lincoln Forum Bulletin. Abbott writes about they're walking through the East Room and they're trying to pretend like they're looking at the paintings and things, but you can imagine just their minds must have been spinning as everyone is staring at them. And the way Abbott described it, as they walked around the room, space would just open up around them. And you get the sense that some people were looking at them in anger, other people in admiration, other people in wonder. And Lincoln's secretary, William O. Stoddard, was there. Mm-hmm. And Stoddard said that this was a practical assertion of Negro citizenship for which few were prepared. And then Stoddard added, it was as good as a play. Mm-hmm. And I love that line. I mean, people are just awestruck by the courage of these 2 men. And then the last one I'll mention, January 2nd, 1865, because the first was a Sunday, there's a New Year's reception. And in the lead up to this one, Lincoln actually, or someone in the White House, presumably Lincoln, let it be known that anyone was welcome to come to this reception. And so hundreds of African Americans line up to enter with the masses. Now, sadly, at this one, the first few get in, and Mary Lincoln and the guards don't want to allow others in. And so the African Americans are made to wait until after all the white guests have come through. But Lincoln, to his credit, sticks around. And for the 100 or more who waited their turn to come in, Lincoln is there to shake their hands as well. And so this is something that happens in the Lincoln White House that's going to cease happening in the years after the Civil War.
Mm. One last question before we turn to the audience questions. We've touched on Frederick Douglass a little bit and how at key times he went and had a personal audience with Abraham Lincoln. And you just mentioned the runaround that some other guests got to the Lincoln White House. Tell us about Frederick Douglass's visit after Lincoln's second inauguration, because I think that's one of my favorite stories always. And, you know, I also think of Frederick Douglass as he's a brilliant orator. He's a very smart and shrewd activist.
Yeah.
He doesn't hesitate to call out Lincoln when he's really disappointed by something he's done or said, but he also makes a point of giving credit where credit's due.
Yes.
And so if you could speak a little bit more to that, what I think was his last visit to the White House.
His third and final meeting with Lincoln. He would go back to the White House again after the war, but this was his third meeting with Lincoln. So Douglass went to the second inauguration, March 4th, 1865, and then afterwards went to the White House for the public reception. And at first, the guards would not allow him to enter. He was there with another Black woman, and the guards wouldn't let him in. And he finally just insists on being able to enter the White House. And so they bring him in, and they had turned one of the windows into a door so that you could have a quick exit, because with these massive crowds. And so the guards take him in. Yeah, here, you can come in. And then Douglass very quickly realizes that they're taking him to this window that's been turned into an exit. And so he demands to see the president, and he sees someone who he knows, and he says, "Tell Mr. Lincoln that Frederick Douglass is here." And so Lincoln comes over and says, "There's my friend Douglass." And Lincoln asks him what he thought of the speech. And Douglass said, "Oh, you don't want to hear my opinion." And Lincoln says, "There's no one whose opinion I'd rather hear." And Douglass says, he says, he compares it to the Sermon on the Mount, and he says that it was a sacred effort, not a state paper, but a sacred effort. Mm-hmm. And Douglass was just elated by this interaction with the president. I mean, he would write about it years later and talk about it in speeches in coming years, but immediately afterwards, he went to a home with other African Americans in Washington, D.C., and is telling this story about Lincoln wanting to know his opinion. And it's a really remarkable moment. Lincoln would invite Douglass shortly after that moment to join him for tea. And Douglass turned him down, because Douglass had a policy of never turning down a speaking engagement that he had already agreed to do. He wasn't going to back out of it. And before he could then get another invitation, Lincoln was assassinated. And Douglass later said, if he had known that that would have been his last opportunity to see Lincoln, he would have gladly turned down the speaking engagement.
Yeah. Thank you, John. So first question from our audience. Paul asks if there's any evidence that Lincoln's lack of discrimination rubbed off on the attitudes of his wife's sons or closest friends and associates.
That's a great question. Lincoln's little boys did play with William Slade's children, and they would go to the Slade home. So William Slade is the valet in the White House and third highest member of the staff, was very close with Lincoln. And Slade's daughter later said that her father had a lot of very close conversations about politics with Lincoln, and that he knew every word of the Emancipation Proclamation before it was issued. So Lincoln was close to Slade, and their children played together. Mary Lincoln is a tough one. Mary Lincoln grew up in a slave-owning household and grew up surrounded by slavery in Lexington, and there were slave auctions right down Main Street from where she lived. And she is the one who at the public receptions is not as open to having African Americans greeted and welcomed in the same way as white people. At the same time, I have found evidence from 1863 of Abraham and Mary Lincoln having tea with an African American. This is evidence from right when it happened, not from years after the war. So it was an evening and they sat together socially, and she treated these Black guests so well that the Black community of, I think, Poughkeepsie, New York.
Poughkeepsie, yeah.
Yeah, slipping on that. Issued a series of resolutions thanking her for how nice she was to the Black visitor. and of course, she was very close throughout the war with Elizabeth Keckley. And after one of the things I quote in the book is that after the war, or after the assassination of Lincoln, the two women who were close to Mary, consoling her in that moment, were Mrs. Keckley, Elizabeth Keckley, and Mrs. Slade. And a abolitionist who wrote about this in her diary said that part of the connection Mary felt to these two Black women was the broader connection that developed between Lincoln and African Americans, and Mary was a part of that. So it's complicated. I don't have an easy answer. I don't think she should be criticized quite as much as sometimes she is on these issues, but then again, she certainly did some things that would merit some criticism today.
So Monica asks, and we touched on this a little bit, maybe you want to expand a little bit more on it. Monica asks if before his death in 1865, Lincoln really was considering granting African Americans the right to vote. We touched on expressing support for limited Black suffrage in that brief speech, but is there any evidence maybe that there was policy about it? And then she also comments that she feels she's always thought that Lincoln was ahead of his time, and wonders if you would agree with that assessment.
Yeah, I think Lincoln was definitely ahead of his time, especially on these issues of the egalitarian nature of his interactions with African Americans and with Black voting rights. I mean, again, he opposed Black voting rights for most of his adult life. There's no doubt about that. But he does come out to be working behind the scenes. There are a number of conversations that are recorded where he talked with white people about supporting Black suffrage. And then again, publicly, April 11th of 1865, he advocates for limited Black suffrage. And that's the first time in the history of the country that a white president is going to advocate for, or I should say a sitting president is going to advocate for Black suffrage. And just to put this in context, so February of 1866, Frederick Douglass is going to come back to the White House with a group of Black leaders, and they're going to push Andrew Johnson for the right to vote. And Andrew Johnson is going to respond angrily to them. And then after they leave, Johnson calls Douglass the N-word, and I think says something like he would slit a white man's throat if he had the chance. So Lincoln is very different from the presidents before and a lot of the presidents who are going to follow.
Melvin asks, why did Lincoln decide to issue the Emancipation Proclamation?
That's a great question. So Lincoln initially opposed issuing an Emancipation Proclamation for political reasons and constitutional ones. Politically, if he did it too early in the war, it would have caused the border states to join the Confederacy. It would have caused mass desertions among Union soldiers who were willing to fight for Union, but not willing to fight for slavery or to end slavery. At the same time, constitutionally, he didn't believe that just because he was president, he could do anything he wanted to. And so while he believed slavery was morally wrong, he believed that the Constitution protected it in the states where it existed. If state law protected slavery, then it was protected there. So the first year and a half of the war goes very badly for the Union for the most part. And by the summer of 1862, Lincoln becomes convinced that an Emancipation Proclamation is what is needed to win the war. And the argument goes something like this, because now he's going to say something that in March of 1861 was unconstitutional. He's now going to say it's constitutional. And here's how. I, as commander-in-chief, who have taken an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the nation, I have an obligation to win this war and save this country. And how can I do that? Well, one thing I can do is seize the property of the enemy and use it against the enemy. And that is a standard practice in war. You could take the property from the enemy and use it for yourself. And so the argument is that by freeing the slaves in areas of rebellion, the slaves will run away from those areas, which means they'll no longer be supporting it through their labor. And then he authorizes them to join the Union Army, and upwards of 200,000 African Americans join the Army. So now it's a double-edged sword. They're not only hurting the Confederacy by running away, but they're now being used to fight against the Confederacy. And so that was the constitutional justification that Lincoln had, and the political reasons too, then, that he for ultimately coming around to support emancipation. But I do want to say one thing about this. A lot of people today criticize Lincoln and they say, oh, his heart wasn't really in it. He really only cared about the Union. He didn't really care about the plight of African Americans or really freeing the slaves. And so this is where another meeting with an African American comes in handy to try to understand what Lincoln was up to. By August of 1864, Lincoln was convinced that he was going to lose re-election. The war is going badly, and he thinks he's going to lose. And he knows that if he loses to a Democrat, whoever wins, George McClellan is the likely nominee, George McClellan will rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. And so he calls Frederick Douglass to come to the White House, and they concoct a plan. Douglass says, look, or Lincoln says, look, I hate slavery as much as you do. The problem is the slaves aren't running away as much as I'd hoped they would. And so they concoct a plan. We're going to send bands of scouts into the Confederacy shouting, run away now while you have the chance, because once Lincoln's out of office, the Emancipation Proclamation will be gone and your opportunity for freedom will diminish. Now, why is this meeting important? Douglass recognized that Lincoln's whole heart was in emancipation. Freeing the slaves in this way had nothing to do with saving the Union, had nothing to do with military necessity, had everything to do with making freedom as broad and as permanent as possible. And Douglass, I think, grew to have such a great admiration for Lincoln after this meeting. Fortunately, nothing had to come of the plan. Things got better in the Union war effort. Lincoln won re-election. But that moment, again, these meetings with Lincoln, I think, are just so important for understanding what's going on during the war.
Yeah, that perfectly segues into, and you partially answered a question Neil had about whether there was any evidence that Lincoln thought of Black people as equals, or was his, I mean, I think basically there's a question of how much is this moral conviction and personal feeling of equality, for example, and how much of this is political calculation. And I think that maybe, you know, if we had a whiteboard here, we could do a Venn diagram of moral conviction and constitutional authority, and so. But if you want to comment on that.
In the 1850s, Lincoln is very upfront. He says, I've never been in favor of making, he says, the Negro a social or political equal of the white man. But then he does add, but just because I don't want them to be equal doesn't mean that Black people should be denied everything. So that's Lincoln's view in 1858. At the same time, Lincoln's view in 1858 is that African Americans deserve the rights, the natural rights embodied in the Declaration of Independence. That when the Declaration says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that means all people of all colors everywhere. And he gives an incredible speech on June 26, 1857 in Springfield, where he uses a hypothetical Black woman as an example of someone who deserves those rights. And he points to his white audience and he says, in this respect, she is my equal and the equal of everyone else here. So that's Lincoln's view at the beginning or before his presidency. He's not in favor of social and political equality for African Americans, but he does believe they should have certain rights that are guaranteed to all people. Those views change over the course of the war. And I hope that some of what I've said has captured some of that in terms of voting rights and the right to be able to serve in the Army and have eventually equal pay, which is eventually given to Black soldiers. Something came to mind, you know, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and this just came to mind about a minute ago as you were asking the question. I think Lincoln had a big, he thought highly of himself, but he also had a very real humility. And the example that comes to mind is when he goes to George McClellan's house. He wants to talk to McClellan, and McClellan's out at a wedding. And so he and I think John Hay are sitting in the parlor waiting, and McClellan comes back and they say, the president's here. He's been waiting a long time to see you. And McClellan just ignores him and goes upstairs and goes to bed. I mean, could you imagine treating the president of the United States that way? Hay was livid, and Lincoln laughed it off. And Lincoln said, of his generals, if he wins battles, I'll hold his horse for him. I mean, that's a real humility that presidents don't generally have.
Yeah.
Now, taking that as context, I think that helps explain Lincoln's treatment of African Americans. Whereas most white Americans in 1863 are not going to shake a Black American's hand, Lincoln is going to. Why? Because he has empathy for people. He's willing to laugh at himself. He's willing to recognize the humanity of the person in front of him. And I think that I think that influenced his interactions with African Americans.
You also referenced to the fact not only empathy but and humility, but an interest in really listening.
Yeah.
And I think that something that is borne out in a lot of research about Lincoln, but in particular in your book, is that he is intellectually curious and willing and interested in taking in new perspectives that inform his own. And
Right.
he even has the quote about how he'll change his opinion and his position on something so
Yep.
quickly that you won't even know that he had held this previous position. We still remember, but
Yeah, and in to Greeley, he said, "I'll adopt new views
That's what
as
it
soon
is.
as they're
Yeah.
shown to be true views." I mean,
Yeah.
that's
yeah.
Lincoln's attitude. Show me a better way to think about it, and I'll consider it.
Yeah, that's the quote. So Stephen asks, do you have any thoughts on how Lincoln developed his remarkable political sense on when to push an issue, when to slow down on an issue, and basically to jockey between those things and evolve his positions to, in particular, bring about, emancipation and greater rights, but also just action. I mean, when
Yeah.
you think about how politics can get so bogged down that action sometimes feels impossible, Lincoln seems to know when to push and when to pull and when to put forward his policy. How did he develop that sense?
Whew. I don't know how he developed it, but he sure had a good sense of reading the room in a sense and understanding what was politically viable at different times. And understanding, on the one hand, he wanted to push his constituents or his followers in the right direction, but he also understood there are only so many ways you can push, or there's only so far you can push before you lose people. And I don't know how he learned that, but he certainly had a good grasp of it. And I will just add this, the abolitionists were pushing him, the radical Republicans were pushing him. And at one point he said to Charles Sumner, the Massachusetts senator, like, "Hey, I'm 6 months behind you. Just give me time." And I think he had a sense of, I need time in order to make certain policies workable. And if you push things too early, you're going to lose out. So I don't know where he got that from, but he sure was good.
Phyllis is back, which means we're almost out of time, but I just want to thank you again, John. And one last thing, what's next for you? What do you have in the pipeline?
I've got a couple things in the pipeline. I'm editing a collection of essays about graves from the Civil War with Brian Jordan. And so that's under peer review, and I'm hoping that'll be in print soon. And then I've just wrapped up a biography of a convicted slave trader and Confederate blockade runner that I need to find a publisher for. So I'm going to be working on that. And then, Aaron, this will be of interest to you. I've written a children's book about Abraham Lincoln. And so I'm thinking I'll need to send it to you and get your feedback on it.
Outstanding. I'm happy to do that. As always, John, great to have you on here with us tonight. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Phyllis?
Yes. Thank you, John, for tonight's discussion on a topic that is still really relevant, even 155 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So that says a lot. I have really enjoyed tonight, and I know our members have also enjoyed this unique opportunity to hear from you about your latest book prior to its publication on February 12th. If you haven't already registered for our upcoming webinars, then I encourage you to visit our website and sign up soon. Next up, we will feature Dr. Ted Widmer during the Fourscore Speaker Series on Tuesday, March 8th for a continuation of our 2020 discussion of his book, Lincoln on the Verge, and we hope you'll join us for that as well. When you close out the webinar tonight, you will see a short survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey, as it helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you'd like to see in the future. We are grateful for each member and donor and sincerely appreciate your ongoing generous support of our foundation. Until next time, we thank you, and to everyone, good night.